He was gone before she woke up. Not gone like a man who had risen early and gone downstairs for breakfast. Gone like a man who had made a decision the night before and executed it before the house stirred, before anyone could ask questions, before his new wife opened her eyes and found the other side of the bed already cold. There was a letter on the writing table. 1 page. Written in a hand so controlled it barely looked human. It said that urgent business required his presence in London. That Mrs. Garvey, the housekeeper, had instructions for the household. That he expected to return within the month. Cecily read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and set it back on the table and looked out the window at Harwick Manor in the early morning light. She was 19 years old. She had been married for 16 hours. The manor was large in the way that neglected things get large, not grand, just sprawling, room after room that nobody had thought about in years, furniture under holland covers, curtains drawn against light that had apparently not been welcome for some time. Her husband's family had owned it for 4 generations. His mother had died in it when Edmund was 12. His father had closed most of it afterward and moved his operations to London, and Edmund had inherited both the title and the habit of treating Harwick as a place he sent things he did not want to deal with. Cecily did not know this yet. She would piece it together over the following weeks. What she knew that first morning was that she was alone in a house she had never seen before her wedding day, in a county she did not know, with a staff of 6 who were polite in the specific way of people who have been told to be accommodating and are waiting to see how long she stays. She got dressed. She went downstairs. She introduced herself to Mrs. Garvey, who received her with the composed neutrality of a woman who had outlasted several arrangements at Harwick and was not yet sure what category this one fell into. She asked for tea and a tour of the house. Mrs. Garvey gave her both. By the end of the first week she had opened every room in the manor and filled a notebook with what each one needed. By the end of the second week she had reorganized the staff rotations, found a leak in the east wing roof that had been quietly ruining the ceiling of the room below it for what appeared to be at least 2 years, and written to Edmund in London to tell him about the roof. He replied in 4 sentences. The roof would be attended to. He would arrange funds. He remained occupied with business. He would write when he could. She wrote back. He replied in 3 sentences. Then 2. Then the letters stopped coming altogether. The month he had promised passed. Then another. The funds arrived for the roof repair, delivered through a solicitor's office in London, impersonal as a bank transaction, and Cecily organized the work herself, spoke with the craftsman herself, checked the repair herself when it was finished. Edmund did not come back. Autumn arrived. Then winter. Then a spring that came tentatively across the Harwick grounds and found Cecily in the east garden with her sleeves rolled up, doing something that the previous occupants of her position had never been observed doing, which was working. She was still there at the end of the first year. And the second. And into the third. What nobody in the county had expected, when they first heard that the Duke of Harwick had married a girl from a minor family in Somerset and installed her at the manor and then returned to London, was that the girl would stay. Most people assumed she would last a season. Maybe 2. That eventually the loneliness or the neglect or the specific humiliation of being a wife in name only would drive her back to her family or to London or somewhere that was not a half-empty manor in the north with a husband who sent funds through a solicitor and did not write. She did not go anywhere. What she did instead is the whole of this story. The first person who actually helped her was not a servant and not a neighbor in any formal sense. His name was Thomas Vane. He was 31, the second son of a family whose estate bordered Harwick to the north, which meant he had grown up with the manor as a backdrop and had known it in its better years. He had been abroad for 5 years, working in land management in Ireland, and had returned to his family's estate 8 months after Cecily arrived at Harwick. He heard about her the way everyone in the county heard about her, through the accumulated observations of people who noticed that the Duke had not returned and the Duchess was apparently running the manor alone. He did not call immediately. He was not the type of man who inserted himself into situations he had not been invited into. What changed it was the fence line. The boundary between the Vane estate and Harwick ran along a stone wall that had been properly maintained on the Vane side and left entirely to its own devices on the Harwick side for long enough that several sections had collapsed. In October of Cecily's first year, one of those collapsed sections had allowed 3 of the Vane cattle to wander onto Harwick land. Thomas had come to retrieve them himself rather than send a man, which was his habit, and had found Cecily in the field already, assessing the damage to the wall with a measuring eye and the notebook she seemed to carry everywhere. He had expected, if he was honest, to find a young woman who was unhappy and overwhelmed and waiting for someone to tell her what to do. He found a young woman who asked him, before he could introduce himself, whether the section near the elm had gone first or the section by the gate, because she was trying to work out how long the deterioration had been happening. He told her. They talked about the wall for 20 minutes. He offered to have his man look at the repair alongside whoever she was using. She said she would send word about the timing. She sent word 3 days later. The wall was repaired jointly, which was practical, and the conversation about the repair led to a conversation about the drainage issue on the north field, which led to Thomas lending her a book on soil management he had brought back from Ireland, which led to a correspondence about the book that was entirely proper and entirely genuine. 2 people who had found in each other someone who thought about land and its problems with the same seriousness. This is not a love story. I want to be clear about that before the drawing rooms in the county get ahead of themselves, and they did get ahead of themselves, because that is what drawing rooms do. What Thomas Vane was to Cecily was something rarer and in some ways more valuable than a romantic interest. He was a neighbor who took her seriously. Who spoke to her as someone capable of managing what she was managing. Who, when the solicitor in London sent funds that were insufficient for a necessary repair in the second year and Cecily did not know who to consult, said plainly that he knew a man in the county who did this work honestly and at fair rates and he would make the introduction. He made the introduction. The work got done. By the middle of the second year, Thomas Vane had become the person Cecily consulted when something at Harwick exceeded her knowledge. Not her confidant. Not her protector in any romantic sense. The neighbor whose land bordered hers, who had seen what she was doing from the beginning and respected it. The county, naturally, made more of it than that. There is something that happens in a county when a young wife is left alone for long enough and a young man of good standing is observed calling at regular intervals. People fill the silence with the most interesting version of events available to them. The whispers were not cruel exactly. They were the whispers of people who had decided a story was happening and were simply supplying the details the actual situation was not providing. Cecily heard them. She did not address them. She had more important things to do. Mrs. Garvey heard them too. She kept her opinion to herself except once, when a woman at the market said something pointed about the Duchess and the Vane boy, and Mrs. Garvey said in the flat tone of someone stating a fact. She repaired the east roof and the north drainage and replanted the kitchen garden and reorganized the accounts and the man visits once a fortnight to discuss the fence line. Then she bought her vegetables and left. In the third year, a letter arrived from London. Not from the solicitor. From Edmund himself. It said he was planning to return to Harwick in the autumn. That he hoped she was well. That he looked forward to seeing what she had done with the place. Cecily read it at the writing table where she had read his letter on the morning after their wedding. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote back. 1 page. She said she was well. She said the manor was in better condition than when she had arrived. She said she would be there when he came. She did not say she was glad he was coming. She did not say she had been waiting. She said what was true and stopped there. Edmund read her letter in London and felt, for the first time since he had left Harwick the morning after his wedding, something that had no comfortable name. There are things that make a man leave that have nothing to do with the woman he is leaving. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Harwick, had married Cecily Holt on a Saturday in September because the arrangement had made sense on paper, the families had agreed, the timing had aligned, and he had told himself that sense was sufficient. He was 28. He had been managing the dukedom from London for 4 years since his father died, and he had understood, in the abstract way that men understand obligations they are not ready for, that marriage was the next item on the list. He had not been ready. Not for the reality of it. Not for the specific weight of standing beside a 19-year-old girl at an altar and understanding that what was happening was not a transaction but a life, and that he had nothing available to give to it. Not because he was cruel. Because he was emptied out in the way that some people get emptied out when they have been managing loss alone for long enough that it becomes the only register they know. His mother had died when he was 12. His father had responded by disappearing, not geographically, but in every way that mattered, and Edmund had learned, at 12, in the specific way that children learn things that shape them permanently, that the people who are supposed to stay do not always stay. That love is something that leaves without warning, and the only protection against that is to not build anything that can be taken. He had built nothing at Harwick. That was the truth of it. He had left because staying required something he did not know how to give, and leaving felt like the only honest option available to him at the time. He had told himself the business in London was real. It was real. But the business in London was also the shape that leaving took when he needed it to have a shape. For 2 years he had not let himself think about Harwick in any terms except the practical ones. The roof. The accounts. The quarterly funds. He had managed it at a distance the way he managed everything, with competence and without feeling. Then the reports started reaching him. Not letters from Cecily. She had stopped writing after the first few months. The reports came from other places. A neighbor of his father's who mentioned in passing that Harwick Manor looked well kept, better than it had in years. A solicitor's note that the household accounts were running with unusual efficiency. A letter from a cousin who had stopped at Harwick on a courtesy call and wrote afterward that the manor was in excellent condition and that the Duchess seemed entirely settled and was apparently on good terms with the Vane family next door. The Vane family. He read that sentence 3 times. Thomas Vane, second son, had been abroad for years, had returned to the neighboring estate. Stood in good reputation in the county. No reason, on the face of it, to find anything notable in the fact that he was on good terms with Cecily. Edmund found it notable. He sat with that for 2 weeks before he understood what he was actually feeling. It was not anger and not suspicion exactly. It was the specific feeling of a man who has left something valuable unattended and returned to find someone else appreciating it, and who has no right whatsoever to object. He wrote the letter in October. For drafts to produce 1 page. He sent it. Her reply came in 2 weeks. 1 page. Entirely factual. She was well. The manor was in better condition. She would be there when he came. She did not say she had missed him. She did not perform any version of the welcome he had not earned. He read it in his study in London and sat with the particular discomfort of a man who has been answered with exactly the honesty he deserved and finds it considerably harder to bear than he had anticipated. He booked the carriage for the following week.
This is the part of the story where I need to stop for a moment. Because what Edmund felt reading that letter is something a lot of people know. That feeling when someone you neglected stopped needing you to come back. And you realize too late that their silence is not patience anymore. It is something that has moved on without you. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And let's continue. Because what Edmund finds when he arrives at Harwick is not what he prepared himself for.
He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The carriage turned through the Harwick gates and Edmund looked out at a manor he had not seen in 3 years and did not immediately recognize it as the same place he had left. Not because it had been transformed into something grand. It had not. But the grounds were tended. The drive was clear. The east wing had a roof that sat correctly and windows that had been reglazed. The kitchen garden, which had been a patch of neglected ground in his memory, was a functioning kitchen garden. Smoke rose from the chimneys in a way that suggested fires laid with knowledge of the house rather than obligation. It looked like a house where someone lived. He had not left it looking like that. Mrs. Garvey met him at the door and told him the Duchess was in the East Garden. She offered tea. She offered nothing in her expression that could be interpreted as a verdict on his return, which was itself a kind of verdict. He walked through the house before he went outside. Room by room, slowly. The Holland covers were gone. The rooms he had grown up knowing as closed off and cold were open and in use. The library had books on the tables that someone was currently reading. The morning room had a writing desk with papers that were clearly mid-work. The kitchen was producing something that made the whole ground floor smell like a house that fed people. He stood in the doorway of the library for a long time. Then he went outside. She was at the far end of the East Garden, working along the south wall. She had not heard the carriage. He stood at the garden entrance and watched her for a moment before she turned. She did not startle. She looked at him with the calm, clear eyes of someone who had been expecting this arrival and had decided in advance what she was going to feel about it, which was apparently nothing she was going to show him immediately. She said, "Your Grace. I did not hear the carriage." He said, "I arrived a few minutes ago. I walked through the house." She waited. He said, "It is in very good condition." She said, "Yes. There is still work to be done in the north wing, but the urgent things have been addressed." He said, "Cecily." She said, "Yes." He said, "I owe you an explanation." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, quietly and without cruelty, "You owe me several things. An explanation is one of them. But I am not sure today is the day for all of it." He said, "When would you like to have it?" She said, "When I believe you are ready to have it honestly rather than conveniently." He absorbed this. She turned back to her work. Not dismissing him. Simply not pretending the conversation was finished when it had barely begun. He went back inside. Thomas Vane arrived the following morning on estate business. His habit on Wednesdays. He came to the kitchen entrance, which was also his habit, and Mrs. Garvey told him before he could ask that the Duke had arrived the previous afternoon. Thomas absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had been expecting it for some time. He asked if the Duchess was available. He went to the morning room and knocked. Cecily looked up from the desk. He came in and closed the door and stood with the expression of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it correctly. He said, "He is here." She said, "Yes. Since yesterday afternoon." He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "I am deciding." He sat down in the chair across from the desk, the one he had sat in 100 times over 3 years, and he looked at her with the direct attention of a man who had watched her build something out of nothing and was not going to pretend he had no stake in what happened next. He said, "Whatever you decide, the work you have done here is yours. Nobody can take that away." She said, "I know." He said, "And if you need me to be difficult on your behalf, I am entirely willing." She almost smiled. She said, "I will let you know." Edmund had come downstairs in time to see Thomas Vane arrive. He had not gone to the morning room. He had stood in the corridor outside it for longer than he intended, listening to a conversation he could not hear, and then gone to the library and sat with a book he did not read. What he had seen in the 2 minutes he watched Thomas Vane walk through the kitchen entrance and ask for his wife was not what the county's whispers had suggested. It was something that made the county's version look small and convenient. A man who knew where the kitchen entrance was and used it as a matter of course. Whose question, "Is the Duchess available?" carried the weight of someone who had been checking on her for a long time and considered it entirely reasonable. Edmund sat in the library with the unread book and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee, what 3 years of his absence had produced. Not a scandal. Not a betrayal. Something harder to dismiss than either. A woman who had been left alone had found, in the absence of her husband, someone who showed up consistently and treated her seriously and asked if she was all right. And the man who had left her alone had no one to blame for that except himself. They had the conversation on a Thursday evening. Not because either of them had scheduled it. Because Edmund came to the morning room after supper, where Cecily was working at the desk, and sat down in the chair Thomas Vane had sat in that morning, and said, "I am ready to have it honestly." She set down her pen. She said, "Then start at the beginning." He did. He told her about his mother. About being 12 and watching his father close up under grief like a house being shut for winter, room by room, until there was nothing left of the man accessible to anyone including his son. He told her that he had learned from that, in the way children learn things before they have language for them, that the people who are supposed to stay are not reliable, and that the only safe response was to not need anyone to stay. He told her he had stood at the altar on their wedding day and understood, in the middle of the ceremony, that he had no idea how to be a husband. Not in the practical sense. In the actual sense. That what was being asked of him required a kind of openness he had spent 15 years building a very effective architecture against. He told her he had left because staying felt impossible and he had not been honest enough with himself to say so directly, so he had used the London business as the shape the leaving took. He said all of this without performing remorse and without asking for absolution. He said it the way someone speaks when they have been carrying something for 3 years and have finally found the room where they can set it down. Cecily listened without interrupting. When he finished she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I wrote to you for 8 months. Did you know that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "The letters got shorter each time you replied. And then they stopped. I wrote 3 more after yours stopped and then I stopped too. Do you know why I stopped?" He said, "No." She said, "Because I realized I was writing to someone who was not reading them the way I was writing them. I was writing to my husband." "You were reading correspondence from the manor." He was quiet. She said, "I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because you said you wanted honesty and this is what honesty is. For 3 years I ran this house. I made every decision. I found the people who could help me and I learned what I needed to learn and I did the work. I am not angry about that. I discovered I was capable of more than I knew. But I did all of it in a house where I was alone, and I was alone because you chose to be somewhere else." He said, "I know." She said, "Thomas Vane called on Wednesday mornings to discuss the fence line and the drainage. That is what he was. A neighbor who took the trouble to treat me as a person capable of managing what I was managing. If you have a version of this where that is something it should not have been, I need you to examine where that version comes from, because it did not come from anything that happened here." He said, "I know that too." She said, "Then what are you asking me?" He looked at her across the desk, this woman who had been 19 when he left and was now 22 and had built something out of what he had abandoned, and said, "I am not asking you for anything yet. I do not have the right to ask yet. What I am asking is whether you are willing to let me try to earn the right." She said, "That depends on what trying looks like." He said, "Tell me what it should look like." She set her pen down and looked at him and said, "It looks like being here. Not in London. Not through a solicitor. Here. In this house, making decisions alongside me, learning what the house needs the way I had to learn it. It looks like Wednesday mornings when Thomas comes to discuss the fence line, you are in the room too, because this is your estate and you should know what is happening on it. It looks like a year of that before I decide what I think about the rest of it." He said, "A year." She said, "You were gone for 3. A year is generous." Something shifted in his face. Not the performance of a man accepting difficult terms. The actual face of a man who has just been told exactly what fairness looks like and has recognized it as fair. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." She picked up her pen. He did not leave. He sat in the chair across from her and after a moment reached for the book on the corner of the desk, the one Thomas had lent her in the first year that she had never returned because she still consulted it. He opened it. She went back to her papers. They worked in the same room, in silence, for the better part of an hour. Outside, the November dark had come down over Harwick completely and without apology. The fires were burning. The house was warm. The roof sat correctly over both their heads. Edmund did stay. Not perfectly. Not without the occasional retreat into the habits of distance he had spent 20 years building. But he stayed in the way that mattered, the daily unglamorous unannounced way. He was at breakfast. He was in the estate room. He was on Wednesday mornings when Thomas Vane came to discuss the fence line, sitting beside his wife, learning what she had been learning for 3 years. Thomas Vane adjusted to the Duke's presence with the equanimity of a man who had never wanted anything from the situation except for Cecily to be treated correctly, and who was now watching her be treated correctly. They developed, over the following months, the practical working relationship of two men who shared a boundary and a genuine respect for the woman who had held that boundary together while one of them was absent. By spring, Cecily had stopped counting Edmund's days at Harwick the way she had once counted his letters. He was there. Not as a man returning to claim what was his. As a man learning what he had nearly lost and choosing, every ordinary day, not to lose it again. One morning in April she came down to find him in the garden at the south wall, doing something with the same length of twine she had been using in November. He was not doing it correctly. She stood at the garden entrance and watched him for a moment. Then she walked across and showed him how. He adjusted what he was doing and got it right. She moved to the next section and they worked along the wall together in the early spring light without discussing it. Mrs. Garvey watched from the kitchen window for a moment. Then she went back to her work.
Cecily never forgot the 3 years. She did not promise to forget them. What she promised, quietly and to herself, was to stay open to the possibility that people can change when the cost of not changing finally becomes clear to them. Edmund paid that cost. He was still paying it, in the daily unglamorous work of being present in a life he had once treated as something he could step away from and return to at his convenience. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was two people standing on the actual ground of what had happened between them, choosing, on an ordinary Tuesday, to keep going. If this story stayed with you, like this video, it tells us this kind of storytelling matters. Subscribe to Duke's Story Hub because there are more stories like this one coming every week. Share this with someone who needs to hear today that being left is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is where the real one begins. We will see you in the next one.